In many of my lectures and discussions with people around the country and in interviews with the media, I am very often asked the same questions. So I thought it might be helpful to cover the most frequently asked questions regarding cults. The first question I'm often asked is, isn't the word cult a pejorative label used to discriminate against a new religious movement? No. It would be disingenuous to ignore the historical significance and modern day applications of the word cult. Today, many controversial groups that have been called cults are seeking to either eliminate the word or create, through the fear of litigation, a reluctance to use the term. Some cult apologists have literally said that cult is a four-letter word and should be replaced by the politically correct title New Religious Movements, or NRMs. However, historically, cults have always been with us, and they continue to be a part of the world today. How is the word cult defined? Well, let's look at a dictionary definition. Webster's defines the word cult in very broad terms. Number one, a formal religious veneration. Two, a system of religious beliefs and rituals, also its body of adherents. Three, a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious, also its body of adherents. Four, a system for the cure of disease based on dogma set forth by its promulgator. Five, a great devotion to a person, idea, thing, such as such devotion regarded as a literary or intellectual fad, or a usually small circle of persons united by devotion or allegiance to an artistic or intellectual movement or figure. This definition obviously could include everything from Barbie collectors to old Deadheads and Elvis fans. American history might also include such a definition for the devoted followers of Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, or the Mormons united through their devotion to Joseph Smith. Both these religious groups were once regarded largely as unorthodox or spurious. However, the most important concern today is not simply who might be somewhat cultic in their devotion, now or historically, but what groups might represent potential problems regarding personal or public safety, that is, groups that are potentially unsafe or destructive. Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who wrote the definitive book about thought reform, often called brainwashing, also wrote a paper about cult formation. Lifton defined a cult as having the following three characteristics. 1. A charismatic leader, who increasingly becomes an object of worship as the general principles that may have originally sustained the group lose power. 2. A process is in use called coercive persuasion or thought reform. 3. Economic, sexual, and other exploitation of group members by the leader and the ruling group. Another question is, don't some groups seen as cults often move more into the mainstream, becoming generally respected sects or religions? Yes, there are certainly examples of groups that were once perhaps thought of as cults that have evolved into relatively mainstream sects or religions. Such examples as the Seventh-day Adventists, once led by Ellen White, or the Mormons, officially now known as the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. But it is also important to note that some groups, which may have once been labeled as cults, continue to be controversial due to their unsafe or destructive practices. Two examples of groups that continue to be problematic and often destructive are the former Russellites, now known as Jehovah's Witnesses, who have prohibited organ transplants and blood transfusions, resulting in numerous deaths, and the Christian Scientists, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, who often reject medical treatment, again resulting in the loss of life. Some groups may say they have renounced unsafe or destructive practices, only to be exposed later as guilty of the same extremes and abuses. Are groups like the so-called militias, patriots, and freemen somewhat cultic? Yes. Many anti-government extremists and hate groups, such as the Klan, skinheads, and even some radical anti-abortion groups, appear somewhat cultic. The Christian identity movement and often violent gangs also share many of the same characteristics as destructive cults, such as the we-they mentality, black and white thinking, and unreasonable fears about the outside world. Radical anti-government extremists have often isolated themselves in compounds or remote settings, not unlike the Waco Davidians or Jim Jones People's Temple. It is important to note that historically there have also been many radical left-wing political groups, such as the SLA that abducted Patty Hearst, or the National Labor Federation, founded by Gino Parente, which exhibit these same cultic tendencies. More recently, the right-wing followers of Lyndon LaRouche appear to have obsessive, cult-like devotion to their leader, and some have referred to this group as a political cult. Can some multi-level marketing and commercial schemes be seen as somewhat cultic? Yes, some commercially motivated groups stress total commitment, avoid answering critical questions, and seem to employ cult-like manipulative techniques to achieve seeming undue influence. Though most lack the intense focus upon a central leader as classic cults do, I have received repeated complaints about alleged abuse within some commercial groups. People considering multi-level marketing need to research a company thoroughly and ask tough questions. Is the company about selling a product or selling its system of distribution? This can be seen by the emphasis it places upon the importance of recruitment. What amount of the company's income is derived from promotional tools and/or percentages paid up the chain of distribution, as opposed to product sales? And what is the actual net monthly income for the average distributor and the average hours devoted to achieve that income? These are important common sense questions that should be clearly answered and objectively proven before becoming involved with any marketing and/or commercial sales group. Are all so-called cults unsafe and destructive? No. Just because a group is cultic and its adherents are focused on unusual leaders and/or ideas is no reason to call them unsafe or destructive. There are groups centered on seemingly strange spiritualists, radical political concepts, the supposed power of crystals, UFOs, witchcraft, or Satanism that may appear eccentric, but most often don't harm anyone. An unsafe or destructive group is not defined by what it believes, but by what it does. That is, the behavior that causes harm and injury to the members of the group and/or others in society. Do you ever find that complaints you receive about a group or person are false and/or unfounded? Yes, there have been times that families have overreacted to a group or situation that later proved to be benign or not dangerous or destructive. This has often occurred regarding claims about Satanism and/or so-called satanic ritual abuse. Such claims have often been based upon supposed recovered or repressed memories gathered through therapy sessions. This is a controversial practice and process that relies upon a theory that has been increasingly rejected as both unscientific and unproven in the courts and by many mental health professionals. Again, it is crucial to understand that behavior is the issue and not belief. When those concerned about someone's group involvement find clearly destructive behavior, this is an issue for legitimate concern. But when a group is simply perceived as strange, eccentric, and or even personally repugnant, such as some adherents to Satanism, this does not mean the group is destructive. Satanists, just as Christians, Jews, and Muslims, have religious rights that are constitutionally protected. I have rarely found that the claims of horrific acts attributed to satanic conspiracies can be objectively proven. And those destructive acts that were proven were rather examples of isolated and atypical groups. This has been substantiated again and again by law enforcement reports and numerous studies. What are the characteristics of a destructive cult or group? Margaret Singer, a noted clinical psychologist and emeritus adjunct professor at the University of California, Berkeley, has counseled and or interviewed thousands of people affected by controversial groups, often called cults. Ms. Singer offers meaningful definitions of unsafe groups or cults in her book, Cults in Our Midst. According to Singer, unsafe groups or cults can generally be defined by three factors. 1. The origin of the group and the role of the leader. 2. The power structure or relationship between the leaders and the followers. 3. The use of a coordinated program of persuasion, which is called thought reform, or more commonly, brainwashing. What typifies an unsafe group or cult's leadership and structure? Again, a good working understanding is offered by Margaret Singer. She states, in most cases, there is one person, typically the founder at the top. Decision-making centers upon him or her. Illustrating the structure, Singer says, imagine an inverted T. The leader is alone at the top and the followers are all at the bottom. There is little, if any, accountability, and as Singer says, the overriding philosophy is that the ends justify the means, a view that allows such groups to establish their own brand of morality outside normal society bounds. What specifically would define a cult or group as unsafe? Unsafe groups or cults often abuse and exploit their members. This abuse may occur in the areas of finances, physical labor, child abuse and neglect, medical neglect, sexual exploitation, and/or psychological and emotional abuse. Extreme examples of destructive behavior have been historically recorded in such groups as the Waco Davidians, the cult suicides of Heaven's Gate and the Solar Temple of Switzerland, and the suicide murder of almost 1,000 members of the People's Temple, ordered by Jim Jones. In 1995, the Japanese cult known as the followers of Shoko Asahara, gassed the subways of Tokyo with the deadly poison sarin, killing 12 and injuring thousands of citizens. Are all unsafe or destructive groups isolated in compounds? No. Isolation can often be less obvious. Many destructive groups create isolation through their control of a member's associations with outside society. The group members may be discouraged from associating with outsiders, especially those who express a negative attitude about the group and its leader or leaders. Isolation can also be fostered by a kind of hyperactivity that allows little time for family, outside interests, or friendships. Marshall Applewhite, the leader of Heaven's Gate, controlled his followers through carefully subscribed daily schedules and regimentation, though the members were seemingly free to come and go at any time. This regimentation and control took place within a mansion in a plush California neighborhood, not an isolated compound. Doesn't the First Amendment protect these groups? Yes. The First Amendment certainly protects all religious groups in the United States in the areas of freedom of belief and speech, but this is not blanket protection for any action done in the name of those beliefs. If a group breaks the law, they are accountable for their actions just like everyone else. Psychiatrist and cult expert John Clark once commented, "The First Amendment is not a suicide pact." Isn't criticism of so-called new religious movements a form of religious bigotry, hatred, and persecution? Americans historically have been sensitive to the issue of religious intolerance since before the Revolutionary War. Roger Williams, a dissenter who disagreed with the Puritans, founded Rhode Island as a safe haven for religious minorities. But the members of many groups called cults often characterize virtually any criticism of their behavior as religious persecution and bigotry. It seems that many cult groups have forgotten that the First Amendment is expansive and protects both their freedoms and their critics. Margaret Singer has said that the conduct of certain cults, especially groups that tend to overtly exploit and abuse people and engage in deceptive, unethical, and illegal conduct, does provoke the surrounding society into a critical stance. What types of people become leaders of unsafe and destructive groups? Many cult leaders seem to be narcissistic personalities, often fantasizing about messianic visions that will change the course of human history, while appearing to have little, if any, conscience. Some make claims that they are the exclusive voice of God, psychic connections to historical figures, or aliens from outer space. Often, these leaders seem deeply delusional and disturbed, and some have been called psychopaths. Marshall Applewhite, the leader of Heaven's Gate, was once confined to a mental hospital. Extreme examples of destructive and delusional behavior by cult leaders such as Jim Jones, David Koresh, and Shoko Asahara have caused many mental health professionals to question their sanity. Still others simply may be opportunistic con men or women, exploiting their followers for personal profit and self-interest. What kind of relationship do destructive cult leaders have with their followers? The leader or leaders most often define what is right and wrong, and their followers are expected to essentially defer making value judgments of their own regarding any issue of significant importance. And any member of the group who questions or doubts the authority of the leader is likely to be labeled wrong, rebellious, suppressive, negative, and in some situations even demon-possessed or satanic. No area of a member or follower's life appears to be immune from such a group's scrutiny or their criticism. A kind of learned dependency often becomes a pivotal factor in such relationships. Members or followers seem highly dependent upon their leaders to resolve their problems and provide them with clarity and purpose. Are there any meaningful boundaries in such relationships? No. It seems that most destructive cult leaders do not provide appropriate boundaries regarding the relationship they have with their followers. Because of this and other factors such as encouraged dependency, thought reform, and little, if any, meaningful accountability, a formula for abuse and exploitation often exists in such relationships. Moreover, the adulation of their followers may have the same effect upon the leader as an intoxicating and addictive drug. This may deepen a codependent relationship between the leader and his or her followers. And such virtual worship may also provide seeming proof to some cult leaders that their grandiose delusions of greatness, power, and absolute authority are true. The more obedience and adulation many such leaders receive, the more they may want and require, and this may become the foundation for ever-escalating bizarre behavior. Is there actually a kind of mindset within potentially unsafe or destructive groups? Yes, there seems to be a typical mindset within most destructive cults. This is often characterized by black and white thinking, a low tolerance of ambiguity, and a relentlessly judgmental attitude. Many members of such groups often think in we-they opposing terms regarding those outside their group. This mindset frequently produces feelings of superiority or spiritual elitism, claims of supposed persecution, and unreasonable fears. These fears typically concern the outside world and or the consequences of disagreeing with or leaving the group. How is such a mindset achieved? Most often, destructive cults or groups are able to shape a mindset through such things as control of communication, association, and information, by hyperactivity and or isolation. This in turn provides the basis for further control of behavior, emotions, and thinking, which has been called mind control. But it should be noted that this is frequently a gradual step-by-step process that includes facets of psychological persuasion and ultimately amounts to intense and undue influence. How can cults use communication to control people? One example would be what Robert J. Lifton, the author of Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, has called loading the language, a feature of thought reform characterized by thought-terminating cliches. Such cliches are easily memorized phrases and terms that essentially become communication shortcuts or ultimate terms. This can have the effect of stopping critical thinking and independent analysis, essentially restricting and ultimately often constricting the mind. How can cults control information? Information is controlled in many cults by creating strict rules and or guidelines regarding such things as books and outside reading, television, movies, radio, music, and often even restricting associations with anyone who might express independent ideas, doubts, or negative feelings about the group. The group and its leader thus may become much like a filter, supposedly needed to help eliminate the pollution, poisons, and negativity of the outside world. How can hyperactivity or isolation contribute to cult control? When people are busy with group activities, there may be little, if any, meaningful time away from the group, except for work, school, or sleep. Group members are thus often cut off and isolated from any outside frame of reference or objective feedback. They become constrained through their largely exclusive associations within the group. This may also include being substantially removed from family and old friends. All these factors can create a kind of vacuum regarding meaningful critical analysis. And then the group and or its leader can fill that vacuum with their own perspective and agenda. How is coercive persuasion really different from normal persuasion? Essentially, coercive persuasion typically relies on thought reform techniques and may utilize unreasonable fear to compel people to change. Through such a process, many can be changed without their knowledge and or informed consent. This is done in a rigid way that frequently precludes any meaningful exchange of ideas, is fairly one-sided, and seems to have little respect for differences. What unreasonable fears do many cult members have? These are fears not based upon objective reality, such as bizarre conspiracy theories, baseless projections of impending catastrophe, crisis, and or physical dangers. Members of some cult groups are warned of an extreme punishment beyond death, prescribed specifically for those who refuse to submit to the group and its leader. They may also be told stories about those who left or were disobedient and how their lives were tragically ended or impacted as a direct result. Many of these stories may be made up, grossly exaggerated, and or distorted, but they reflect an implicit purpose, which is to intimidate members and thus retain them within the group. What is undue influence? People can be seen to be under undue influence through their diminished capacity for critical thinking. That is, an individual who becomes dependent, such as through cult indoctrination, upon others for value judgments, rather than making their own independent decisions. Our judicial system recognizes undue influence as a form of diminished capacity, that may be exculpatory in mitigating a judgment regarding the commission of a crime. There is a notable difference between the levels of influence employed through education, advertising, propaganda, indoctrination, and thought reform. Undue influence usually is the result of unethical and/or improper techniques of persuasion as administered by an authoritarian figure and/or hierarchical structure. Some have offered the analogy that the Marines are not unlike authoritarian cults, and they use undue influence to train and control their recruits. However, there are very basic differences between the operation and conduct of the Marines and most destructive cults. Marines understand clearly what they are joining and, further, have checks and balances regarding the accountability of their superiors who are ultimately held accountable by democratic institutions of government. Representatives in that government are elected by the people. So there is a system of checks and balances that guarantee a Marine's safety and preclude the abuse that is characterized in destructive cults. Can one individual gain destructive cult-like control over another person? It is possible for a cult to be composed of one leader and only one follower. This also can be seen as a one-on-one, deliberately manipulative and exploitive intimate relationship between two people. Some marriages or domestic partnerships where there is spousal abuse may be characterized and explained in this way. This is sometimes called a cultic relationship. An individual dominated within a cultic relationship may be so completely under the influence of another person that they seem to lose their ability to think independently, much like the member of a destructive cult. The person in submission is also frequently isolated from family and friends and becomes very dependent upon the dominant authority figure. Are cults and other controversial groups deceptive when they recruit people? Yes, they often are. They may employ deception in the recruitment process by using front organizational names and/or not clearly identifying themselves or their purpose. For example, a religious cult may not even initially advise potential recruits that it has a religious agenda. Groups with controversial leaders may withhold that information and also keep their more radical beliefs hidden or secret until they achieve more influence and compliance through their indoctrinational process. What types of people are recruited by cults or become involved in potentially unsafe or destructive groups and relationships? All types. People from strong and troubled families, with and without psychological histories, those who have had and have not had drug problems, with a solid or weak religious background, the educated and uneducated, the wealthy, poor, middle class, intelligent, and not so intelligent. One of the myths about cult involvement is that a certain type of person is more vulnerable. Another myth is that healthy, strong, intelligent, well-educated people from good families don't become involved, or that somehow, if someone has clearly defined religious convictions, they cannot be recruited. These theories have never been proven or substantiated through research. In fact, repeated studies continue to indicate a wide and varied background for cult recruits. Frankly, cults are quite good at persuasion and indoctrination. It's their stock and trade. And most people simply are not prepared through education and personal experience to be sensitive to the possible impact of their methodology. The truth is, almost anyone could potentially become involved with an unsafe or destructive group. We are all especially suggestible at certain times, when depressed, lonely, during an awkward transition, when within a new environment, such as a college campus away from home, after a romantic breakup, death in the family, or some other personal problem or ordeal. Since all of us have such experiences, We all have periods of vulnerability. And destructive cults and groups have honed their skills, timing, and focused their programs to exploit such situations as opportunities for recruitment. But aren't these people just weak and stupid? No. As previously mentioned, cult recruits are often caught at a particularly vulnerable time and probably did not recognize the warning signs necessary to make a more balanced and informed decision. In everyday life, this can be seen to some extent when people make poorly informed decisions, largely based upon the influence of slick advertising and sales gimmicks. There are many examples of such successful but often unethical methods of persuasion through high-pressure car deals, land and stock swindles, misleading infomercials, and boiler room phone solicitations. Many intelligent and successful celebrities and stars have become involved in some groups that have been called cults. Specifically because these well-known personalities are so strong and compelling, some have been used to promote controversial groups and defend them. Ironically, the very reason they are useful to such groups is the public admiration and respect they enjoy, and the perception that they are role models and often trendsetters. People are often frustrated and anxious about the world around them, and most of us seem to have a need for answers, security, a sense of control, a feeling of belonging, and a desire for personal recognition. Today, there are millions of true believers who faithfully accept psychics, UFOs, angels, questionable multi-level marketing schemes, political extremism, conspiracy theories, and demagoguery. People find things to believe in that fulfill a need for explanation about an increasingly complex world. And at times of personal crisis, such beliefs may fill a personal void within. But personal voids, burning questions, and the need for answers are not unique to any single type of group. Instead, they appear to be part of the human condition. If such a system exists to coerce, persuade, influence, and control people, then why doesn't somebody use it to take over a nation or the world? This has already happened. The politics of fear, control of information and the environment, and the use of propaganda has been successfully employed to control nations. Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, the Ayatollah's Iran, and Saddam's Iraq are just a few examples. Such intense influence and control allowed Hitler to set the stage for the Holocaust. Many dictatorial and extreme national leaders have historically been labeled as megalomaniacs and psychopaths. They are not unlike destructive cult leaders, who often have messianic pretensions and delusions about world influence. In this sense, movements such as Nazism, Stalinism, and Maoist philosophy can be seen as cults clearly fitting within the criteria advanced by Robert J. Lifton in his paper on cult formation. Hitler, Stalin, and Mao were all charismatic leaders who increasingly became an object of worship as the general principles that may have originally sustained their groups lost power. These leaders also employed obvious thought reform techniques and exploited their followers. In the United States, during the Red Scare of the 50s, there was a mindset that came to be known as McCarthyism. This mindset produced overwhelming intimidation, information control, propaganda, and unreasonable fear. During that bleak era of American history, Senator Joseph McCarthy dominated and profoundly influenced the thinking of a nation.